Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. And this video is a continuation from my Top in the World walkthrough. So this video I'm going through paper 2, which is the human geography paper and part of the exam season that I took last year, where I got top in the world. For this paper, I got 48 out of 60, which isn't that high, I believe. I think I could have done better, but it was still sufficient enough for me to get top in the world. This video, I'm going to go through how I approach the paper, some tips and tricks, and how you can improve to become better than me and get even higher scores, and hopefully you will be the future top in the world. So without further ado, let's get into it. So section A is something that you have to answer. And one interesting thing to note about human geography and section A is that there's a mix of topics. So you can see here, population is combined with migration. Topic 1 is generally about population, but there's some inclusion of migration over here. Topic 2 is generally about migration, but as you can see here, there's population slash migration slash settlement dynamics, whereas settlement dynamics is just settlement dynamics. Even down here in section B as well, there are a mix of things. So this shows that actually when there is a combination of stuff, you don't have to limit yourself into just talking about migration. You can talk about population stuff. You can talk about settlement dynamic stuff. This is because human geography and these three topics are so interlinked that you just can pull things from different things so that you can think, if you run out of ideas to talk about for migration, for example, you can start thinking about settlement dynamics or perhaps birth rate and stuff in population. There's just so much more you can do in human geography than physical geography, where you're just limited to one topic essentially. But anyways, let's start with question 1. Fig 1.1 shows the population change for Australia and HIC in Oceania and Romania and MIC in Europe 1980 to 2020. So you get this insert paper over here and you scroll down, and this is the first graph, figure 1.1. Part A is generally a data question when they ask you to look at the graph or the picture in the insert and ask you to identify any data points. The question asks for the comparison of the population changes for Australia and Romania. And essentially you just use the graph, like what's happening here, and you compare them. But do note that you do have to compare them. So when you're saying that, for example, Australia has a net increase from here to over here, you have to say, on the other hand, Romania has a net decrease from here to here. So you always have to have some linking sentence to show that there is a difference between them. You can't just identify separate parts. Another thing to know is that you have to use the data points to secure the mark. Sometimes in the mark schemes, they are lenient and you don't have to identify the data and the years, but it's just generally more safer to use the dates and the data so that you can secure the mark and also maybe get an extra mark for a development of the data point. So obviously one is that Australia had increased from here to over here in 1980 to 2020, whereas Romania has fallen from here to here in 1980 to 2020. Another trend is that Australia's growth is continuous and almost linear. As you can see, it's kind of a straight line with a upward curve, whereas Romania had increased slightly until 1990 and starts to decrease. And that's a comparison you can make, how the trends of population is more linear for Australia, whereas Romania is more up and down. So that's a comparison as well. And perhaps another comparison for if you want to get 3 marks is that Romania always had a higher population than Australia until this year, which was around 2007. And after that, Australia's population was higher. And then that is also another comparison. I did those 3 in my exam and I got 3 out of 3 for this one. For 1B, it suggests 2 reasons for the population change in Romania between 1990 to 2020. And you have to be careful here because the original graph shows 1980 to 2020, but this asks you for 1990 to 2020. And as you can see here, 1990 is this over here. So you cannot talk about the part where Romania's population was increasing only when it's decreasing. And generally, there's only 2 reasons for a population decreasing. And as you can see here, there's 2 reasons. Number 1 is that your birth rate is lower than your death rate. So more people die than are born. That can be through more deaths from diseases or something, or less births from the introduction of contraceptives, for example. Another reason is migration. So when you have more emigration than immigration, so more people leaving your country, and therefore you have a decrease in population. But note that even though it's 2 reasons, there's 3 marks available. This means one of your points, either birth rates to death rates or emigration or net migration, has to be developed, right? Use the marks to see what you have to do. And because you're limited to 2 reasons, one of your reasons have to get that extra mark. And this can be true using examples. If you know about the history of Romania, you know that it was a Soviet republic. So after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was much more open borders, the Iron Curtain collapsed, so there's more migration towards Western Europe. So therefore, you have higher emigration. Birth rates and death rates, I'm not too sure about the history of Romania, but you can talk about certain things, like even just mentioning there may be an increase in availability of contraception or education on that might be able to push you into getting the 3 marks. In the exam, I only got 2 out of 3 because I did not manage to get the development mark because I didn't realize it was 3 marks compared to 2 reasons. But just keep an eye out for when you're limited to a few reasons and also the marks. And in that case, you can get 3 out of 3. 1C now is explain why some countries with large areas with have relatively low population numbers. And as you can see, there's 4 marks available, so you can either do 4 points or you can do 2 developed points. In the exam, I did 2 developed points and I got 4 out of 4. So this question is essentially asking you why countries like Russia and Canada and Australia with large areas have low populations compared to their areas, right? And it's kind of example-led because obviously there's only a few selected countries, and your development point can come very easily from the examples. So there's a bunch of reasons you can provide. Number one can be the extreme conditions in Siberia for Russia or in northern Canada, where you basically can't live there. So your population is limited to where you can live, where agriculture can grow food, and that's why your population is low compared to the area. Another reason can be historical reasons. There are a bunch of examples, but for example, Russia, they were involved in World War I and World War II. And in those wars, well, tens of millions of Russians died, which pushed down their population numbers, having low birth rates, which leads to a low relative population compared to their area. Another historical reason can be the timeline. So for Australia, if you know about the history of Australia, they were developed a few centuries ago, and before then there was like almost no population at all. So with such a short amount of time and such a large landmass, obviously civilization can't develop that fast and fill up the whole Australia. So because of time, Australia right now has low population relatively compared to their landmass. So just mentioning these with some developed examples. So this involves quite a large history lesson, but with some external reading, you can get this. And in this question, I got 4 out of 4. For next question, which should be migration, but as a combination of 3, Fig 2.1 shows the percentage. Oh, sorry, by the way, this one I got 9 out of 10. Fig 2.1 shows the percentage of the population who were born in another country 2015. So it's your second graph now, or diagram. And it's basically showing the number of migrants in a country, essentially the percentage of migrants. And it wants you to describe a pattern. And you basically just use the diagram, right? Because that's all you can use. You can talk about how that there's like almost no pattern because you can see these purple areas are scattered everywhere. So the pattern is like very unusual. It's not like a clear set pattern, but obviously there is also some patterns. So one pattern can be that the pattern is kind of unevenly distributed with some major spots, also some outliers as well. You can talk about how in HIC, so like in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, the migrant numbers are quite high compared to MICs and LICs, like in South America and Africa and South Asia, for example. And you can talk about the continents where in Australasia, in Europe, and in North America, they're high. Although HICs and the continents or the hemispheres kind of match up, you can still mention them as separate points But just be careful because sometimes mark schemes are lenient and give you that mark, but sometimes they're not. You can talk about how there are anomalies. So after you talk about how Asia is kind of low, you can talk about how Kazakhstan is quite high over here, and in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, UAE, they're quite high. Even in Africa, you can talk about Libya having there and Gabon having being an anomaly. And so these are kind of regions where you would expect a low percentage because of the overall trend. But then again, there are anomalies. And also, one last thing about the tropics. The exam generally gives you these things as a hint, right? You can, even if you talk about HICs and the continents having higher thing, you can then talk about how generally, if it's north of the Tropic of Cancer or north of the equator, you get much more higher percentage than if you were in the lower one. And with that, you're able to get 4 marks. This one is a bit hard, I admit, and I only got 2 out of 4 for this one. But if you want to look past the repetition, that is how you can like develop these marks for like these niche and small differences between the answers, and that's how you can like kind of squeeze through the 4 marks. For 2B, suggest 2 reasons why some countries attract a high number of international migrants. And essentially, this is just 2 pull factors. And there's, as you can see here, there's 3 marks for 2 reasons. This is just 2 marks for 2 reasons, so you don't need any development. You can just talk about 2 reasons, like countries having greater educational opportunities. If you want to bring in examples, you can. You can talk about how there's higher pay in certain countries, like in the USA compared to Mexico, and you just get that 2 marks. For 2C, explain why international migrants are often concentrated in inner city areas of the receiving destination country. And as you can see here, inner city, that's a big hint about settlement dynamics, even though the main topic is migration. Again, this is 4 marks, so it can either be 4 development points, 3 development points, 2 development points, and just however you want to structure it. And for this question, I got 3 out of 4 because I think I didn't get awarded for one of the developed points. But there are kind of simple things. If you want to, because you can bring in thermodynamics, you can talk about how there might be a donut effect where the inner city areas are much more derelict compared to outer city areas. So it's much more cheaper. The housing there is much more cheaper. You can rent housing, which is cheaper in the short term, which might attract migrants over there. The jobs might be concentrated in inner city areas, which means that if they want to migrate to look for jobs, they are often concentrated there. But again, there are also things such as infrastructure, right? Airports, train stations, they're all generally directed towards inner city areas. So when migrants reach there, they're kind of stuck there in the inner city. They don't have much contact or cars to go to different places. So that's why they're often concentrated in inner city areas. If you want to get development points, you can think of examples like CIE is a very international course. I mean, it is international. So you can bring in wherever you're from, right? If you're from Malaysia, for example, you can talk about how talk about the examples in Malaysia of why inner city areas are migrants are concentrated in inner city areas. If you're in the UK, for example, you can talk about those reasons. You don't really need to know it by like some extra places. Like if you don't live in the USA, you don't know about the USA, you don't have to talk about that. You can just talk about your own experiences, and that's able to get you the developed marks, and then you get a 4 out of 4. Because I lost 2 marks for A and I lost 1 mark for C, I got 7 out of 10 for this one. And the last one is settlement dynamics. Fig 3.1, which is this one. Oops. It shows a photograph which shows a settlement in the Comas district in Lima, Peru, and MIC in South America. So this is like a shanty town in Peru. And this one suggests 3 problems for the people living in settlements shown in 3.1. There's 3 marks for 3 reasons, so you just need to identify 3 things. So as you can see here, it's kind of pretty high up. So obviously there's a risk of landslides, right? There's also issues, as you can see here, there's no roads or anything. It's like very steep. So there might be issues with transportation where people like struggle to get down there, so it's difficult to access and difficult to leave the area as well. You can talk about how there's a lack of infrastructure. So generally when there's infrastructure, it should be like you have electric lines over here or something, maybe, and you can't really get the pipelines through higher places for sewage, for example. So infrastructure is very limited in these areas. You can talk about how there's no greenery at all, so that might lead to some issues like, again, the landslide issue, or maybe just not a pleasant place to live in, right? It's just um, some push factors that make people like not comfortable in the place. So that is just 3 reasons. You can just look at this diagram and see maybe the housing is kind of like not well developed. As you can see, is like kind of old and made of bricks, so they might be unstable. And yeah, but then there's just 2 advantages for people living in settlements. So there's 2 marks, and you get 2 marks for 2 reasons. And you can talk about things how like the land is cheap, right? Obviously, shantytown areas they're undesirable, so the land is almost free it's almost free for you to develop, and you can kind of claim as much land as you want. To be honest, advantages are really difficult to find. I only got 1 out of 2 for this one, but there are also things you can see, like how there's quite a lot of space. Like the buildings between these things are like quite large compared to where you're stuck in a city where you kind of like live next to your neighbor. So there's more privacy for you if you're more spacious compared to your neighbor. So that is one thing as well. In shanty towns, generally people are more like connected together rather than isolated. So you might get a stronger sense of community as well. So there are just some advantages you can infer, not necessarily just from the picture, but you can just infer what are some advantages of living in settlements. Because well, not because, it just, you can infer it essentially. It doesn't have to directly be picked from the picture, it can be inferred. That's what I'm trying to say. All right, 3C, explain why it is often difficult for a government to improve shanty towns, squatter settlements. This is 5 marks. So you have to either do 5 explanation points, or you can do 3 development points. So 5 points or 3 develop points. I did 3 develop points and I got 4 out of 5 marks for this one. But you can talk about stuff how if you improve shantytowns, so shantytowns get better, that's just gonna attract more migrants in, increasing the pressures, and therefore it's just going to be a cycle of never-ending improvements. And that's why it's difficult, because issues are going to come, then you have to improve it, then more issues are going to come, then you have to improve it. So the cycle of more migration pressures would lead to it being difficult to improve it. There are also things like displacements. If you have to improve an area, like building infrastructure underneath the ground, like pipelines and stuff, to improve that, you have to displace people, and these people are already living in the most derelict places. So if you displace them, then they have actually nowhere to go. Another thing, obviously, is cost. It's expensive to build infrastructure and have some improvement policies, and therefore it is difficult because it's costly, and it's not really cost effective to kind of build up these shanty towns for these people, whereas the money would be better spent somewhere else, like developing industry. There might also be local resistance. So people in the shanty town just might want to be left alone. They don't care about improvement by the government, so they might resist it, and therefore the government faces opposition, and therefore it's difficult. There's a lot of reasons for this. Generally, saying 5 points is much more easier because you can think of a lot. But if you manage to think of examples quickly, then you can put it in and get some development marks as well. So for this question, for this part 3, I got 7 out of 10 as well. So in total, I lost, that is 7 marks. So I got 23 out of 30 for section A. Now, section B. you only answer one and you specialize on it. Again, as you can see here, that's kind of the triple thing again, like the combination of topics again. And I looked at the 15 markers to decide what question I wanted to do. For this one, a high rates of for population, a high birth rate analysis will prevent their economic growth. I'll like this question was like fine. I think I could have done that. But then I looked at the migration one, which is with 8 examples. How far do you agree that it is difficult for governments to manage rural to urban migration? My case study for this one wasn't that developed, so I decided to not do this one, definitely. But then for this one, for settlement dynamics, there is a limit to how large a city can grow in size. Like, I think this is just such a open and broad statement that you can discuss so much about. So I decided to ultimately talk about do this question, because with so much to write about, you can just get the 15 marks very easily. So for 6A, describe the characteristics of a central business district, CBDs. And it's a describe question, so you don't really have to explain. So you can just talk about things like how there are tall buildings, there is generally not a lot of residential compared to there's being a lot of offices and shops and services. There are large transport hubs and transport links to the areas. There's a lot of subways, like public transport is developed. There's a lot of road networks. There's a lot of entertainment as well. There's high land value. There's so much you can talk about. And again, if you watch my last video on physical geography, for section B, you have to include examples. Examples are your best friends, and they are explicitly stated in the mark scheme. So you have to use examples for these section B questions. And obviously, a lot of people live in cities as well, so you don't really need that much other than your own knowledge. If you've been out touching grass, you know what are examples of these characteristics in your central business district, and it should be an easy 6 or 7 marks. I got 6 out of 7 over here. Not sure why, but it's good enough, I think. For 6B, with the aid of examples, explain why there are challenges for many CBDs. So 8 of examples, you have to use examples, right? You cannot get away with not using examples, because the mark scheme explicitly wants you to use examples to just develop your points. So there are a lot of issues with CBDs, right? So you just pick out, because this is 8 marks, you can pick out 4 points or 3 points. So you can split it where it's 2 each, or it is 3, 3, 2. Like, you just decide how you want to split the marks yourself, and then write that much. If you are aiming for 2 each, you don't have to write as much per point than 3, 3, 2, but then you have to write 1 additional point. So it just depends how you want to approach these types of questions. So issues in CBDs include how there are traffic congestion, for example. There's because a lot of people go there, it's where most people go for jobs and highest population. Then there's going to be a lot of cars, a lot of traffic, and you're going to get stuck in traffic jam. So that's one of the issues, and that's why people leave these areas. You may also see crime. Crime is a big issue in CBDs, especially when you have such a large population. The crime statistics are going to be enlarged in absolute numbers. Even though like the percentage might be low, with more people, you're going to see more crime in actuality. So crime, you can talk about how there's a lot of been a growth in acid and knife attacks in London, for example, and those are issues in CBD, and you have to explain why these are issues. You have to explain how CBDs, people of all socioeconomic backgrounds live there. There's more isolation, so there's no like community life compared to rural areas or like more outskirts areas where you're friendly with your neighbors. So with more people unknown to each other, there's a likelihood for higher crimes. And there's also issues for terror attacks. So terrorism is a big part. They usually target CBDs because they gain the attention and they do the most damage. For example, you can bring in 9/11, the September 11 attacks on the Twin Towers. You can bring in the Manchester bombings, all examples of terrorist attacks because they want to do the most damage, and CBDs have the most people and the most economic value. So terrorist attacks target CBDs, and that's why those are challenges as well. So you have to describe the issues, but primarily it's explaining why the issues are there. So why are there traffic congestion? You have to explain how more people means there's more cars. People have to commute to the CBD for work, so they must go there every day, drive cars every day, for example. And you can bring in examples like in the USA, in Atlanta, or in Texas, in Austin or Houston. The traffic jam gets really bad in rush hour because CBDs have the most jobs there, so people have to access there. However, I only got 5 out of 8 for that question. I think I flunked it somehow, but I'm not entirely sure because the examiner didn't put too much feedback on this question. But it should be you should get easy marks, especially if you like develop your examples a lot. 6C is the big case study 15 mark question. There's a limit to how large a city size can I missed this. There's a limit to how large a city can go in size. With the 8 examples, how far do you agree with this statement? So this question is how far do you agree? If you watch my last video, the last video was evaluates the attempts to something mass movements. So it's not an extent question, but this is explicitly asking you how far do you agree. So it's an extent. Therefore, you have to say how far you agree. Do you agree moderately? Do you disagree strongly? Do you disagree largely? All these terms of a continuum. So this is a continuum of agree, disagree on the left side. And then agree over here. And these are complete, like this is completely disagree and this is completely agree. And then you just have to pick where you believe you can argue in this continuum. For my points, I talked about the existence of megacities, so the evidence of megacities to show how there has been indefinite growth of city sizes, but I also talked about things like political and physical limits. So political limits, physical limits. Generally, for these questions, you want to show a bit of balance. So my megacities one is a paragraph disagreeing with the statement, so there is no limit. My physical one is agreeing with the statement to say how there is a limit, so it's agreeing. And my political paragraph was a mix, but it was primarily agreeing. So with these 3 points in mind, now I'm gonna show you how I plan the essay. It's very similar to how I did the plan in the physical paper, but because it's human geography, there is a small bit of changes. So as always, write down introduction, and then P1, P2, P3. P1 to, I'm just gonna combine them. If you have 4 points, you can talk about 4 points, but I work best with 3 and I can talk a lot about that, so I'll just combine them into one, and then you have one conclusion at the end. I'm not going to go into these in too much detail because it's all theory. I'm just gonna teach you how you should structure your paragraphs because I think that's the most important thing. But obviously you can infer how megacities like, for example, Mumbai have been growing so much and they have increasing growth every year that you can kind of see there has been no limit. Political wise, there are things like the green belts in London, which limits it themselves, but there are also things like regeneration and urban renewal, where it kind of improves the city areas, which leads to more people coming in. Physical is kind of self-explanatory. If there are physical barriers like oceans and mountain ranges, then block cities. But then there's also a trade-off. If you want to expand urban land, then you have to take away rural land. And rural land is where food supply comes from. So if you grow urban land, then you have to have a decrease in rural land, which means less food supply. So there has to be an eventual balance of those two. So that's how I argued my each points. So for planning your 15 markers, your introduction has to have a definition or like the criteria you're trying to fit in. For this question, I talked about what is the definition of urban growth. And I made a video on urban growth and its definition, where I talked about how it is not only the increase in absolute population numbers, but also the increase in the physical size, like the land area of the city. So there's two criteria it can fit in. So if you are interested in watching the video, please watch it because I think they're really good, but they don't get any views, which is sad, but oh well. So after you get the definition down, you can start introducing your case studies or providing some context, right? So you provide some context. You can talk about how in recent times you are starting to see a lot of issues in urban areas and cities where there has been mass migration outwards with counter-urbanization. However, in certain cities, like mega cities, there have been in mega cities like Rio de Janeiro or Mumbai, you can see how these cities have sorry, I keep hitting the mic, have continually grown, and therefore there has been no limit. So there's a context providing an explanation of both sides and your points that you're gonna bring up. And then after that, you want to explain your judgment. So your judgment, which is how far you agree, right? Your judgment has to relate back to the question, and your answer to the question is this extent thing, how moderately or largely or slightly you agree or disagree. For my judgment, I said it was true to a large extent, so agree to a large extent. And then after your judgment, you have to provide your thesis statements, which is your explanation of your judgments. So this is how you like completely formulate an argument. So instead of just leaving that I agree, you have to explain why you agree. And that thesis statement is something that links to all your paragraphs and your conclusion. It's the argument that you're trying to sustain and ultimately why you agree. And my thesis statements, I didn't include it because I wasn't a good essay writer back then, but my overall arguments was something like there is a trade-off where cities can grow until a certain point, but then eventually issues start arising. There's a trade-off of certain things, which means as a city grows, issue arises, which eventually mean the growth starts to stagnate or even decline. So that's my thesis statement, and yeah, that's a simple introduction. If you want to disagree with the statement, so you want to say there's no limit to how large a city can grow, then your judgment can be you disagree slightly or somewhat, and then your thesis statement can be talking about developing technologies. So you can say how technologies resolve the issue of food supply, or urban planning ensures that cities can grow sustainably and indefinitely, which therefore means there is no limit. So there's a bunch of ways you can argue this. I went with I think the most simpler way, because physical is a big constraint to or obstacle to go past. But yeah, argue the side that you think you have the most examples or points to talk about. For your main body paragraphs, you want to have a clear starting point, starting sentence, and that is telling the examiner what you're going to talk about. If you're going to talk about megacities, say the evidence or the existence of megacities point towards or suggest that there has no limits to the urban growth. Or you can talk about physical barriers and the trade-off or the physical trade-off of rural land to urban land supports the statements that there has been limits, right? You want to highlight your points as the main thing, which gives an examiner a clue to what you're going to talk about, which makes your whole essay more structured and the examiner would like you more. Then after that, you want to explain your points. So explanation I guess I mentioned it already, but like how the fact that mountains are legit just physical barriers that you can't really develop on, and therefore they prevent your city from growing landmass wise, and that's an explanation, right? And then you can provide examples of this. So you can talk about um, some mountain regions that prevent cities from growing, or even the oceans that basically you can't build on oceans, and therefore they are physical barriers to your city. So you can think about coastal cities that can't go past the coast, and therefore it's the limits, right? Um, but then you want to talk about evaluation. You want to evaluate how true that is, right? If you can show how that is true, with like no limitations, then show it. But for the example of megacities, you can talk about how megacities are growing, they have high natural increase, high migration inwards, and then you can highlight examples like Mumbai and New Delhi. But then you want to evaluate it. You can talk about how in other megacities like London and Tokyo, the population have started to decrease or stagnate, and that's because of things like increasing cost of living um, as a country or city develops more, and therefore there's a lower birth rate and less people want to migrate inwards, and therefore you evaluate your point, which shows that you acknowledge there are some issues with the point. But if you want to then evaluate the evaluation to support like your physical point, for example, or your political point, for example, um, something you can bring up is like how politics, like urban planners and stuff, they can come in and they can regenerate buildings, right? That is one point that shows that cities can keep going because that just encourages more migration inwards. However, you can then evaluate that evaluation by talking about how um, to 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 start regeneration in the first place suggests that inevitable problems will arise, and that regeneration will eventually have to displace people, which means people have to migrate out, and it just shows that um, continuous regeneration is unsustainable, and therefore there is a limit. So you're evaluating the evaluation, which strengthens your point, and just shows that you understand the concept and this theory more. You understand the complexities of these issues. And then with these three things, explanation, examples, and evaluation, the triple E, you have to repeat that as many times as you want. And after that, that's essentially how you structure your paragraphs and essays. Conclusion, you restate your judgment again. So you state how you strongly agree or largely agree or moderately disagree, whatever you want. And then you expand on your thesis statement. So for example, you might have talked about how as a city develops, the cost of living issue starts to increase. As a city develops, then more issues will arise, right? That's your initial thesis statement. Then you want to expand on it because you should have talked about it in your paragraphs, and then you say what issues arise. The issues are traffic congestions. The issues are the lack of food supply and food security. These are all explanations and evaluations you have talked about, and then you can use it to expand. So remember, you can't introduce new ideas in your conclusion. You have to use what you've said in your paragraphs to then put it into your expansion. Otherwise, you're just introducing new things, which like doesn't make sense because it's your last paragraph. So keep to the structure where your intro is clearly defined. Your paragraphs, keep the structure. Make sure you're on track of time. Don't like repeat that too much time until that you can only write one paragraph. And then your conclusion is a simple one, restating your judgment and expanding on your thesis statement, which is your main arguments. For the 15 marker, I got 14 out of 15. So it's pretty good. and because of that, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, got 25 out of 30. and that should sum out to 48. Yeah, that's correct. So I hope this video is helpful for you guys. Yeah, I just hope that these videos can help you guys get good marks in your exams. That's all for me today. Make sure you stick to these things. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll try my best to respond to them, but exams are starting soon, so please give me some time to study first, then respond to you guys. But other than that, hope to see you guys in another video, and hope you guys got help from this.